I'm guessing more than one person here knows why that's not going to work. Somebody give me the answer here.
So not checking state, it's not causing a re-render of the component.
Okay.
The state isn't being, it's not being saved to state.
Yeah. And yes, it's not being re-rendered. And just changing this value is React isn't going to know that the component needs to be re-rendered, because React isn't, well, JavaScript isn't capable enough for React to like watch this variable and see if it changes and then react to it. Okay. So the React team said, okay, well, we need a way for consumers, developers, to be able to tell us that something has changed, state has changed. And so we can re-render the component. And when we re-render, we can render DOM using the new value, okay? And this doesn't necessarily match one-to-one to DOM, right? But it executes components and eventually gets to DOM and can use the updated state. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to do something like this. I think most of you are probably, I don't know, maybe not. I'm not going to make any assumptions here. But there's this array looking thing. It can be kind of weird for a fresh engineer, but we're going to produce this array, destructured array, and we're going to use this useState from React. Right, and we're going to initialize it with 0. I want to talk about what's going on here. So useState, this is a hook that comes from React. Now notice I didn't get useState from the counter component. I just imported useState from here. And this can be kind of tricky to understand how this is working at all. And I want you to think through the eyes of the React development team. When they created, so this is called a hook. This is kind of, fairly newish. And if you think about React and how it renders and how it renders things, I have this app component up above, and it renders counter as a child, right? So from the top level, React is saying, okay, I'm supposed to create an element. Okay, so counter itself is a component. This is one instance of counter. It's also called an element. Okay, the element will eventually make it to virtual DOM. Virtual DOM will eventually get it to real DOM. And when it renders counter, it's going to call the counter function that we set up over here, right? And so it knows what's rendering. It can know that, okay, we are rendering the first element that we're producing for the counter component. And when we're calling this function, and the developer, us, is calling useState here, it knows that we're trying to use state for that particular instance of that counter component. Okay? So just think about like the kind of bookkeeping that's happening in the React side. So what we're saying here is let's start some state. Let's start it with 0. And then this is going to represent the current value of the state. This is a function where you're going to be able to update the state. And if you think through here, it's going to start out as 0, and then the next time, let's say that we click the button. I haven't actually called set click count here. But if we call set click count, and I'm just going to do click count +1. Okay. So if I call this function, I'm telling React, hey, I got some state that needs to update, which means I'm probably going to want to re-render. And React is going to know, okay, you're calling the function for the state that matches the first time useState was called inside the counter component. Okay. So the reason why that's important is if I had 2 here, like click count, whatever we want to call it, right? Foo and set foo. or something entirely different. How does React distinguish this state here from the state here? And that is simply by order. So when it's rendering and it's like, okay, I need to, React is like, okay, they've called useState. We need to produce a click count for that useState. Do we have anything like from the last render? Do we have anything for the first useState that was called? And if so, we need to produce it here. And then when it continues rendering this component, it sees we're calling useState again. Okay, do we in our bookkeeping, in React's bookkeeping, do we have anything for the second useState that was called when we're rendering this component? If so, it produces it right here. And in fact, you'll notice that if I were to do something like this, let's do math.random. And we'll say if it's greater than 5, we're going to use some state. Sorry, if it's greater than 0.5, we're going to use the state. Otherwise, we're not. Okay. And let's see what happens here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to I'm going to click that implement button a couple of times. So what happened is it re-rendered and we get this error here. You might not be able to see that. Rendered fewer hooks than expected. This may be caused by an accidental early return statement. What React is basically saying is, okay, like maybe the first time we only saw you, the developer, call useState once. But as we re-rendered, math.random is sometimes above 0.5, sometimes it's below 0.5. So in other words, when this component is rendering over and over, sometimes we're calling useState once, sometimes we're calling it twice. And React's like, nope, I'm going to get totally confused because the way that it knows, the way that it can associate click count with this first useState and foo with the second useState is there's always the same number of calls to useState. That needs to always be the same number of calls. And they always need to be in the same order. So if I like tried to switch this around on one render and switch it the other way on another render, it would get confused because it all only knows how they are associated by index, by the order in which they're called. Okay. Any questions so far? I did just dig a little bit deep.
No, I was just wondering, is there an example of a use case why you would put useState in something and then want to switch it back?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So not really about ordering, like I don't see that one very often, but one that I do see is like in a callback. So like in an on click, if I have a function for an on click, I might think, well, I can just call useState right in my callback and use the value there. And it's not obvious that I need to actually pull it up to the top level of the component. And so if I try to call useState in that callback, it's going to complain because it's like, yeah, like you're doing something with the order. We don't want to get confused. We're not going to promise you anything. And so you'll see that error or that warning. I don't know what it is, but does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Cool. That's a great question. Anybody else so far? Okay, that was actually a little bit deeper than I was expecting to go on that one. But it's good. And if you didn't understand that, like, I think, from a usage standpoint, you don't really need to know all the internals, but in my mind, it helps to understand why the React team did what they did and how React is behaving a little bit, because it can keep me out of those weird niche scenarios like this and keep things solid. Okay. So, okay, I want to switch over to a different one. Oops. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right, so this one is building on the other one. Okay. And we have a counter function. Again, we have the counter component. I never actually showed you that last one working, did I? But believe me, it works. So this one is kind of a variation of the other one. when you click this button, it's going to call this increment after 1 second. Okay. So we're not calling set click count immediately. We're calling it after a second passes. Now you might think this is contrived, and it is. It's very contrived. But you know, if you think about like the like button on Medium, it's a little hand, and you kind of hold it down, or like I don't know if you use Medium, but like you hold down the like button. Essentially, it's a clap button, and the longer you hold, the more claps it gives the article, right? And it waits like, I don't know, half a second or a second between claps, right? So this can come into play in that kind of scenario as well. But also, anytime I say set timeout, you can also usually swap that out with like a fetch call to a remote server. The important thing is with the set timeout and a fetch call or anything like that is we're asynchronously doing something, and then when that thing is done, we're trying to set state. Okay. So here, the set timeout, yes, it's just for this like demo purpose, right? But anyway, so we're going to click this, and we're going to wait a second, and then we're going to call set click count, and we're going to increment click count by 1. Notice I'm logging the new click count here, a new click count. We'll see what it actually is. Okay. So if we switch back over to here, refresh, and I'm going to click this once, and after a second, it incremented, right? Now I'm going to click this twice quite quickly. Oh, actually, before I do that, notice this, new click count 0. You may not have like been expecting that because after all, we did call set click count. But notice click count was 0, right? Like in this closure, click count is 0, and nothing has changed click count yet. When you call set click count, what you're telling React is, here's a new value, and please re-render. And it's only on that new re-render that we're going to get the new value from React that we just passed in. In this case, it should be 1, right? So that's really interesting, right? Click count here is still 0. And if I click this twice really quickly, oh, I'm gonna reset this. Okay, 1, 2. Okay, we got render new click count, render new click count. That's weird, right? We ended up with 1. When maybe you think that we should have ended up with 2. So what's happening here? So if we look at this button, we have we click it once, and we're coming through this function. We're calling set timeout, and notice nothing has called set click count yet, right? It's only after 1 second that we call set click count. I'm already clicking the button again. I clicked the button twice. We're calling this function again. Oh yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you. Yeah, we're calling this function again the second time, and again, no set click count has been called yet. On the second click, we're still going to wait a second, right? So I kind of have these two asynchronous processes going at the same time. The second for the first click count, the second interval for the first click finishes, and we call set click count. Now remember, click count, it's trapped in this closure. If you don't know what closures are, I really suggest learning about them. But essentially, the click count as it was when it first rendered, when counter first rendered, is trapped inside this function, and it's 0. So therefore, when the first second finishes, we're just saying set click count to click count plus 1, which is 1. Now, the second interval for my second click finishes, and still the click count for that second call is trapped as 0. Even though we re-rendered, we may have re-rendered from the first click, that doesn't change the click count reference in the function from the second click. I hope you can connect those dots. That's a little tricky. Okay, and it's just one of those things you kind of gotta, once you get into closures, you'll start to see the pattern. So let's go. So that's why you're seeing new clicks, renders. you know, and new click count of 0 each time. Yeah, go ahead.
So will it show 0 as many times as you click increment within that 1 second timeout?
Yeah. It'll always show 1 at the end.
Gotcha. If you waited a second per click, would that change?
Yeah. So if I click this, wait a second, click it again, wait a second. It's just that because I do all the clicks at the same time, all of them at the end are going to say set the click count to 0 plus 1, 0 plus 1, all of them, because the click count when all of those began was 0. And that 0 is kind of trapped in that function closure. I hope that helps. Any other questions there? Okay. Tricky, right? Now, React gave us an interesting thing to help solve that. So what they did is they say, okay, we get it. Sometimes you want the new state. You want to get the latest state, and then you want to increment it. And so instead of just passing a value into set click count, we'll also allow a function instead. So for the setter, I can actually pass a function in. And what will happen? So I'm using some shorthand here, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm passing a function to set click count. And what React will do is on the next render, it's going to call my function here, and it's going to pass the click count as it is on the next, like before the next render. It's right before the next render. And then we're going to be able to increment. We're going to say the click count plus 1 and return that, and that will become the new state for the next render. Okay, so so let's follow this through then. I click once, and this runs, and we're waiting for a second to pass. I click it again, it runs again, and now we have 2 1-second intervals starting, right? The first 1 second interval ends, we get into here, and we call set click count, and we pass the function, okay? So what's gonna happen is the component's gonna, right before the component re-renders, React needs to know the new state. And so it sees that you've passed in a function. So it's going to provide click count of 0, and we're going to return click count 0 plus 1, which is 1, right? And it's going to re-render. Now that second 1 second interval is still going, and it'll finish. And so that will come into here. And here, instead of passing 0 plus 1, we're passing a function, right? And so what's going to happen is, right before the next render, again, React needs to say, okay, I need to get the updated state. I see you passed a function in here. We're going to provide you the most up-to-date value of click count through this function, which is 1 at that point, okay? And so I can return 1 plus 1 equals 2, and that should give us what we're wanting. So if I refresh this and I click it twice really fast, notice that it says 2 here. But this is interesting, right? Anybody notice this? This is interesting. We're getting new click count 0 on the console logs. Why is that happening? Well, like I said, our function here is not getting called right when we make this call. It's going to get called right before the next render. So when we get to here, console log, for both times I clicked it, click count is still going to be 0. Okay? So that's really interesting, because if I ever need to know the very most up-to-date count inside of this function, and like down here, I need to grab the latest click count to pass it to a function or something. I can't really do that. And that can be really frustrating. And you'll see where useRef kind of comes into play later on because of that. Okay, questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So on line 9, you didn't have to use click count for that
Oh, yes.
parameter name. It could be anything.
In fact, I probably shouldn't because that probably confused you with the actual click count up above. Like, let's say I just underscore this. Thanks for asking this question. Yeah, this variable, they're not the same as this variable. It's a different variable. I just named this argument whatever I wanted to, and I just referenced it here. This, whatever value I return, becomes this on the next render. Okay. This is actually getting a little deeper than I was expecting. This is good though. I like it. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think not really a question, but something that's made it click in my head is because it was originally confused me. I'm like, well, wouldn't it get like the new estate after it renders, but it's not actually hitting that. It's not actually calling the set click until timeout is over.
Yeah.
So it still has the old value.
Yeah, it still has old value. Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, someone else.
If you expand the arrow function, you can put the console log on the inside.
Yeah, I could put a console log on the inside here. And I could do this.
Message from the chat was they can't see your pointing.
It
So
might help if you turn
Oh,
on
yeah.
the camera, Aaron.
Yeah, you should. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of pointing. I'm gonna try to like select code. I think that'll help. But I can also turn on my camera. Thanks for bringing that up. Maybe I actually don't have an option to do that.
Companion mode. I don't think you do.
Good thing. All right.
Well, we'll just go with highlight.
I'll try to highlight code a little bit better. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, if you put a console log in here, then you could either log out this click count, which that will get logged right before the next render, not when we're making this call, but sometime later, right before the next render. Yep. Okay. Okay, cool. Okay, I want to go through a couple. I'm gonna go through. Ooh, there's so much good stuff. Okay. I'm gonna go through a couple interesting problems. See if we're catching this, if we're understanding it. Okay. I really should have just changed the font size, but never. Okay. So here's something, what we're doing here is that we just want to make a timer, like a clock that increments 1 second every second that passes. We're doing a useEffect. We haven't talked about useEffect yet, but essentially this function is going to run on the first time that this component renders. We've set an interval that should, this function inside. Oh yeah, sorry. This function inside of here should be called every second, and we're setting this time variable up here. Okay, that is not going to work. Why? Even though we're passing it down to clock, so we think, oh, if we change it, maybe clock will get the new updated value. No, we still need to re-render app in order to get the new time value that we're setting here down into the child clock component. And the only way that we can do that is by calling, I shouldn't say the only, there's several ways, but the primary way of doing that is to use the useState hook and set a new value, okay? That will re-render the app component, which will allow us to drive that new time value into the time prop of clock, okay? So if I were to render this right now, I would just see a clock, but it would never update. The interval's going, but like nothing's updating. That's because the app is never refreshing, even if like the interval's going or setting that variable at the top. Okay, another one I want to show you is this one here. This is a common. I see this one sometimes that causes bugs. So here we have our app, and we are using useState. We're initializing it with just some empty data. a name of an empty string and an age of 0. Oh, that's not very, okay. And then we have a button at the bottom called update user. Let's just look and see what this looks like. It's like this, okay? A name, a button at the bottom. When we click the button, we're going to update the user with a new name, okay? So let's click the update user button, see what happens. Nothing happens, okay? But we're calling the setter. Why isn't it working? And we're setting name to a new value. This is a JavaScript thing, and it really starts to speak to how React is determining if the state has changed. When we call set user, the way React knows if a change has actually occurred and therefore it should re-render is by reference. And what I mean by that is this object, this user object, it's the same object in memory that we got during the render. Let me say that a different way. The component renders user starts out as this object that we're creating here for the initial state value, right? When we click the button, this update user function is going to get called. This user object is the object we created here. It's the same thing in memory. We're changing the name property of that object, which is not the same as changing we're not swapping for a different object. We're just changing the content of an object. And so when we call set user and pass user, it's the same user object in memory that React saw before for the state. And so even though we're calling set user, it doesn't know that it's a different object. So it's not going to re-render. And that's a problem. And that's why we don't see the new value here. So how do we do that? We need to give React a brand new object that's different from the old one. And there's various ways of doing this, but the most common here would be we do user and then name Tom. Okay. So basically what we're doing is we're cloning the user object and then we're updating the name property. We're overriding the name property with Tom. And because we're providing a new object that's different from that initial object, React can see the difference and it can re-render and the name shows up. So if I refresh, click update user, we get the new name. Okay. We clear on that? Is it getting a little bit more clear? Yeah.
One question I have with this example, it's just sort of a best practice question because I know both work.
Yeah.
But I noticed that the React docs recommend if you're going to manipulate state that you should pass it in as a prop, the previous state, and then modify it. Like you did in your past example with the set timeout.
Yeah.
In this example that you didn't do it that way. I'm wondering if there's an advantage one way or the other.
Trying to think. So I'm trying to think so the React doc, I think, I don't know what you're referring to be honest, but I think
You go back to your code,
yeah.
for updating your user and set that to an arrow function, pass in, user, and then you're destructuring that passed in prop. So the question is that versus what you did, benefits,
I
drawbacks.
got you. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, I got it. Yeah, and that, yeah, I could see somebody having that opinion. I could see them having that opinion. Yeah, and I haven't really thought about that, but I think the reason why they would say that's the best practice is because when you do it this way, where you're passing in the function into the set user, you're kind of guaranteed that you're going to get the latest value in state. Whereas if you don't, you're more likely to find yourself in that position where the user that's trapped in this function maybe isn't the most up to date from state.
Depending on what kind of closure it might be.
Yeah, and when it happened and what else is going on in the component. So that's a good point.
I would say 95% of the time I see it not passing in. So it may be technically more correct and safer. As long as your code above it is probably pretty clean, you're using good naming conventions, you're probably not going to run into the edge cases that's helping you prevent. I don't know of any performance benefits or anything like that, but there's probably those slight edge cases that it could help you avoid.
Yeah.
Never do more work than you have to.
Yeah, we're lazy.
Yeah, those are great points. These are great questions. Thank you for asking all of them. Okay, I'm going to start moving into useRef. Okay. Let's hop over to this. Where should we go? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about this one. Okay, so here's what we have here. We have a timer, 0 seconds. We have a start button and a stop button, right? Just a pretty simple timer here. Our JSX looks like this. Oh, it still is hard to read. Bump it up some more. Okay. Yeah, here we go.
Changed your theme, it would be easier.
I know. I don't want to dig into the property web source properties like
I
the
know.
best. So
No one wants to.
I should have before this. Next time I will. So here's our JSX. We have the timer here. We have the button. When you click the start button, it calls the start handler. When you click the stop button, it calls the stop handler. Okay. So let's say we click the start button. What are we doing here? We have this if timer ID ref.current return. Okay. So when we click the start button, what we have to do is check to see if we've already clicked the start button before without having clicked the stop, in between. Because if it's already started, we don't need to start it again. Is that clear enough? Okay, so how are we going to know if we started it before? We're using a ref. This is what this ref looks like. You call useRef. You can provide an initial value, and you get a ref. And this is probably like one of the worst names thing. I don't know. I don't know what's better, what it would be better called, but like it's hard to understand that what a ref is. So when you call useRef, React returns a ref object that has a current property on it. Okay. And you can manipulate that current property all you want, pretty much whenever you want. There's kind of an asterisk to that we won't get into, I don't think. And it will not force a re-render. Okay. And whenever you look at the ref.current, that the timer ID ref, that'll get captured. It doesn't matter what closures it gets captured in, which render we're thinking about, regardless of where we access that timer ID ref.current, it's always going to have the latest value. Okay. This is React's way of saying, I know you want like local variables, and sometimes you probably don't want to, re-render the component, and you really always want that value to be the most up to date whenever you access it. We're going to give you a ref. There's other reasons why we have it too, but why .current? Why is the .current? Actually, let's go through this and then I'll ask you why .current. Okay. Well, maybe this will help. So we're going to be using timer ID ref to store the ID of the timeout that I think it's it had to be an interval. Yeah, to store the ID of this interval we're setting. Okay. Yeah, so so we click start handler. If timer ID ref.current is anything, then we know it's already running. So we're just going to return. But if not, then we're going to start our interval. We're going to set interval. This returns an ID, and we're going to store it on timer ID ref.current. Okay, so timer ID ref.current is going to be a number. And that's it. Well, I should say every second we're going to call set count, and we're just going to update the count by incrementing it with 1. Okay. So let's see what that looks like. We're doing start. Just re-rendering. We're setting the state every second, re-rendering each second. Okay. Now, if we click stop, we need to stop that interval, right? And so the way we do that is clear interval, and we get the interval ID by timer ID ref.current. And in this case, I'm setting timer ID ref.current back to 0, kind of an initial state. And that's, so if I click stop here, I should stop the interval. You should stop updating the state, should stop re-rendering. Okay, now I could have used state in this particular case to store the interval ID. And there's one reason I didn't in this particular case. One, the biggest one, I didn't need it. I don't need to re-render the component when I'm starting this interval, right? Like if I click this start right now, right when I click it, I don't need to re-render the component. There's no use. I'm only going to be re-rendering the component after the second's done, and we need to like increment the timer label, right? And also, we know that timerref.current is always going to have the latest, and that just makes my brain, it just makes the problem simpler for my brain to think about. It always is going to have the latest. So let me see what I got here. Why do I use current? Why did the React team choose to make this current property on the ref? Why not have me just set timer ID ref to the interval ID right here? Why don't you just have me do that instead? Does anybody know why? Can anybody answer the question? No?
A lot of stuff.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so your component is defined as a function.
Yeah.
And each render is a completely isolated separate call to that function.
Yeah.
Right. And so in order to be able to share a reference to a variable across these isolated function calls,
Yeah.
we need to have a stable reference to a variable that you could refer to no matter what function call you are in. If
Yeah.
you didn't use an object, then when you set the interval and updated it to a new value, then the other functions would be referencing another value. There'd just be independent values. There'd be no way to share. So by using an object, it's one single reference. Every single render that ever happens can reference the single object, and they can always depend on .current to have the latest value as it's updated.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also remember a few years back when class components were big.
Yeah.
It's very easy to just declare variables in your class. And
Yeah.
then in your render function, that's the only part that changes all the time. But with functional components, like was just said, oh, my name, sorry, it always re-renders each time.
Yeah.
So you lose access to that variable that you have. So there's other purposes for useRef, but for the same reason, that's why it's kind of the way to do class variables in functional components is the .current.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both. That was great. I'll try to say it in a different way with the visuals here. So if I did this, if we said, okay, the React team just said, you can just set the ref directly, okay? And I followed their example and I said, okay, I'm just going to set timer ID ref directly. What I'm doing there is setting this variable, which is just local to this one render execution. It's not changing anything that React knows about. Setting this variable doesn't change the underlying ref value that React has. And so, yeah, that's why we have this .current. They give us an object that they always hold on to, and they're just passing on every render. And they just set up a current property on it, and I manipulate that current property. That underlying object sticks around for every render. So anything that's looking at that object, particularly the current property on it, is always getting the latest value that we set on that current property. So hopefully that's starting to make sense. So these are the important points, the differences between the two. And this one was like it's kind of an optimization one, but well, it's not entirely optimization. I still think there's a lot of like mental ease of thinking about it when you're always talking about the latest value. But here's the differences. useState, the value should be treated as immutable. You always have to call the setter with a new value. We talked about that previously. Calling the setter will re-render the component soon. You're not really guaranteed when that's going to happen, but soon. The new value is not actually set until the next render, and we saw that as well. Okay, you're not going to get the new value. You're not going to get the new value in the component, like the full component, until the next render. useRef, you can mutate ref.currently directly, and you can mutate content. If ref.current is an object, if you put an object on there, you can mutate the content of that object as much as you want, whatever. Because React doesn't care that it's changing. It doesn't care. It doesn't need to re-render the component. It doesn't care. You do whatever you want with it and whenever you want with it, pretty much. Mutating ref.current will not re-render the component, and the change is immediate. You're just setting a value. That's it. It's nothing fancy React stuff going on. You're just changing an object. Okay. So there's some other really good stuff. How long do I have? How long do you want me here? How long do you have? You have stuff to show though.
I can always do it another time though.
Always me.
I want to
Yeah.
get to
Always next month. Go for it.
no, I want to get to something kind of. I want to get something. The reason I even brought this topic up is because I've been thinking a lot about useState and useRef lately. Let me kind of show you this interesting thing I came across. This was probably a year or two back. We were creating a. Oh yeah, okay. We were. Yeah. Let me hop over to this real quick. At Adobe, I worked at Adobe for a while there, and I was creating a hook called use paged combo box. And basically it's a hook to, the term's kind of headless UI. So you could build a combo box and design it however you want, style it however you want, but the main logic would be inside of a hook. Managing the selection and loading of items, not the actual fetch to the server to load items, but kind of the asynchronous loading of items and showing a loading indicator and opening the menu when the user hits this like the down arrow, and a lot of this type of logic. Accessibility, that's one of them too. I wanted all of this stuff to be handled, and I was using state for a lot of the stuff. But then I found myself, like, I had a bunch of these functions, callbacks, and I would also like call a function that was passed in as a prop, so that I could tell the consumer of this hook, hey, it looks like they scrolled to the bottom. We need to load more items in, and kind of delegate that loading functionality to the consumer of the hook. Say, load me some more items, give me some more items so I can show it, or like store it in the data. So there's a lot of like this asynchronous stuff going on, right? And I started moving some of the stuff over to refs, and that helped like get rid of a lot of the bugs I was seeing that were asynchronous. But then I found like, well, some of the stuff I do want to re-render the component. I'm like straddling this state and ref thing, and so I'm like, okay, great. So that means for these variables, I'm gonna have to set up a state so that I can set it and re-render a component. But I also need this ref so that I can make sure I always have the latest value. And it became really complicated. And I was sure I wasn't the first one that ran into this. And so I started doing some reading, and for this particular example, I came up with, I got rid of the states. I was like, I just want to handle this myself. Maybe this is dumb. Maybe this is a dumb idea. And I would say, if you're kind of inexperienced and you get into the situation, think really hard before you do this, because you're basically taking on a big job, but it might actually solve a lot of your headache as far as trying to figure out what's going wrong asynchronously. So what I did is I created a ref here. Let me make this bigger. I created a ref here with a lot of the state that I had. Items, selected item, input value, loading state, show all, cursor. Cursor is like a paging cursor for loading in pages of options. An abort controller for like aborting requests that were outstanding when they're no longer relevant. And I just stored this all inside of a ref. But some of these things, when I changed them, I also wanted to re-render the component using this hook. Like, just to give you a little bit more context here, at the bottom, this object I would return would include some functions and some data that the component that's using this hook could use. So for example, we returned a set selected item function in case they want to like imperatively set the selected item, on input change, on selection change, on open change. So like, for example, on OpenChange, we would call that function, and then the component using this hook could show the menu however they wanted to. Onload more, and then a bunch of this stuff that I had in the ref. In fact, here are the keys to them. Items, selected item. These are the things that I was storing in state that I was exposing to the consumer of my hook. And so when those things changed, I need to re-render the component. So basically what I did is, okay, anytime I'm going to change data, I'm going to pass in the changes into this set data function I've set up. And I basically go through all the properties and I say, okay, is the property different from what I'm trying to update to? If it is, I know the property changes. I know we're going to need to re-render. If that property is one of those, that should cause a re-render. And that's why I have this external data keys. If the property name is in external data keys, I know I'm going to be providing this to the consumer. So I need to re-render their components so that they get access to the new values. Might be kind of difficult to follow, but basically I took over the state management and the rendering, the actual rendering. I didn't call set state, except for, see this, if I know that it needs a render, I call this force render function. And I'm just using a hook that basically all it does is calls set state and increments the number. That's every time I call force render, that's all it's doing. The number is not really useful, but by incrementing the state, it's forcing the component to re-render. And I've seen more of this lately. In fact, Tanner Lindsley, he may even be on the call, I don't know. But I saw him tweet about this recently, and I was like, oh, so it is happening elsewhere. And I'm not too dumb because I look up to Tanner. He's very smart. He says, when I build libraries for React, ironically, I don't really use hooks like useState, useReducer, etc. One of the best perks and footguns of managing your state outside of React is that you get to have full control over when a component should re-render.
We did that like last week, right?
Yeah,
Or maybe it was
Something like
more
that.
than that.
on March 18th.
Oh.
And he said a great use case for this is when you need to call a bunch of state altering functions in succession. There's no waiting for your updates to come down the React pipeline. In other words, waiting for the next render. So you get up-to-date values immediately in your private state. Then when you're finally ready to commit them to your component state, you can send your private state to your component, usually by saving it to a ref, or by by saving it to a ref. Don't forget to trigger a re-render, or by using set state. I don't know if you follow that, but he's saying, yeah, you manually just re-render the component whenever you need to. Okay, so I usually use one of those hooks. In other words, in order to re-render, you have to use something like useState to just force it to re-render like I was doing. Rule of thumb here is that once you take responsibility for managing state outside of React, you need to be extra aware of batching, unintended overrides, and especially mutating your component state during render. Either way, it's a powerful pattern to learn about and master. So this is kind of what he's doing in React Table. He creates, he basically says, okay, this first time through here, this first render, he's going to call create table instance. And this is creating like an instance. I think it is a class. I don't know, maybe it's not. He's creating an instance of something that's going to manage all of his logic. And it's not going to have React like set states or anything in it. It's going to manage all of the data modeling and logic. And on every render, he's just going to call update options on that instance. So he's going to give the latest options that are coming through the hook into this instance, and the instance is going to react to it and do whatever it needs to do. When the instance knows that, okay, the component needs to render because we have something new and interesting, he's going to, oh, he doesn't actually show you here, but, oh yeah, no, he does. So he's going to call this re-render function that's been passed into the instance. This re-render function, it's a little bit more like it's using a useReducer, but it's doing the same thing that I was talking about, where you're just incrementing a counter every time. This one-liner forces a re-render. You can break it down if you want to, but it just forces a re-render. what are some interesting things about this? I thought it was really interesting because as he starts talking about taking React table to view table, well, the React specific part of React table is this like binding between the instance with all of its logic and rendering the components and providing that information to the engineer. So he can use the same like table instance object with all of its logic and state handling and just subscribe to it from Vue or React or whatever it needs to wherever it needs to happen and re-render the component whenever the instance tells it to. Does that make sense? It also, I think, maybe this is just me thinking, but I also think it helps in his particular case test his instance. Like the instance is just JavaScript; it's not React. As far as I'm aware, there's not really React in there. Could be wrong. But yeah, you just test it like a normal JavaScript thing, and it's really the boundary between the instance and whatever framework we're using, like React or Vue, is very specific and it's very clean. It's through this observer. Anyway, I thought that was cool, and he's doing the same thing with React Query, by the way. Very similar pattern. So just some things to think about as you get more advanced and get into those really hairy situations where you're dealing with a lot of callback functions and state and need the latest and all that type of stuff. I wouldn't recommend digging into this until you're kind of advanced because it is heavy. I think I'm going to leave it for that. I'll say a couple other things. React 17, in certain cases, when you call set state one after another, in some cases it would batch those states and it would wait until all of those set states were called and then it would re-render with all the new data. In other cases, it would not. It would re-render the component after each set state. I actually have examples of both, but we're not going to get into it. That's kind of an exercise for you, I guess. React 18, they changed this. React 18 was recently released and they're batched now. By default, always. I think that's a pure statement. And so that's actually one of the benefits of going up to React 18 is that they're better at batching those. That's all I'm going to do. I actually thought this would take longer, but I liked getting into the detail. So, or I thought it would be shorter, sorry. Anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to me. I hope it was helpful. I did post this on a GitHub repo if you want to like check out the branches and play around with it. I don't know where I'll post that.
We'll post it into UtahJS Slack. We'll do the meetups, and then there's also a React channel as well. So I'll post it in both of those places.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Thanks guys. And Dal.
I saw that tweet when he tweeted it, and I had no idea what the heck he was talking about.
Yeah.
Until now, which is pretty sweet because I was just like, take state outside of React. Hell no. Like that sounds awful. But that makes a lot of sense using ref.
Yeah.
Which is great. I see useRef and useState, 6,000 times every single day, and there's a lot of awesome stuff in there. So checking at time, we can go into another one, but it's not going to be nearly as great as that. Or we can wrap it up and network, kind of get a pulse. It's our first time, so I'm going to try and gauge a little bit of this. Also, if you got feedback or something you'd like to see or something you want to see different, go ahead and shoot me a message on Slack, and we'll try to make this better and more enjoyable for everyone. Thinking call it a night, thinking go on.
Pizza and kind of getting to know everybody here.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's call it a night. I'll save the portal thing for some other time. Hopefully someone else will volunteer to speak next month. Next month, same place, same time. Other than that, though, thank you everyone for coming out. Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. What's your name? Sorry. Jesse. I'm like this other guy. I should have waited for your example of